All right. Good Erev Shabbos. I wanted to talk about an experience that I had today. I had a particularly difficult Erev Shabbos this week because I was asked earlier in the week on Chol Hamoed to officiate at a funeral today for the first time since the coronavirus outbreak began. And it was a very difficult emotional experience. Now, I've been to funerals where the person who passed away was a young person who died well before their time, or because of illness, or because of terrorism. And I've officiated at funerals for members of my own extended family, for people I didn't know, and for people within our KTM community. Um, but this was really different. This was very difficult. This was gut wrenching, and I want to if you're willing to go along for the journey with me, I want to share some thoughts that I had about the experience this afternoon. I want to talk about it through the prism, through the outlook from our parsha. There is in Parshat Shemini a sudden and tragic death. The Torah says that the two oldest of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, they die suddenly during the inauguration ceremony of the newly constructed Mishkan, the tabernacle. They brought some kind of ish zara, some kind of strange or inappropriate foreign fire before God, and in response, they are consumed by a fire emanating from heaven, and they are killed. And now this episode, I mean, I've talked about this, almost every year in Parshat Shemini, because there's so much to this episode it's so important, so many different levels. And Moshe sees this happen, and he immediately turns to his brother Aaron with the following enigmatic response. Vayomer Moshe al Aaron, Moshe says to his brother Aaron, Hu asher diber Hashem lemor. This is what God was talking about when he said, Bekrovai ekadesh apnei kol ha'am yikaved, that through those close to me I am made holy, God is made holy, and before the people I am glorified. And then the pasuk ends, Vayidom Aaron, that Aaron was silent. Now, I'd like to home in on specifically what Moshe was trying to say to Aaron by saying, Bikrovai Kadesh, that God at some point said to Moshe that he is sanctified through those close to him. What does that have to do with the deaths of Nadav and Avihu? Okay, of course, people are close to God, sanctify God's name through their behavior. What does this have to do with anything? So Rashi cites the Midrashic reading. He's not quoting, and there's different versions of this, but essentially a lot of the Midrashim say that Nadav and Avihu, that what Moshe was saying about Nadav and Avihu was that he was saying to Aaron that clearly Aaron's oldest sons, Nadav and Avihu, were great people. Because in rabbinic literature, the term krovim means relatives, people with whom you're very close, you have a familial relationship. And despite whatever it was that they did that led to their deaths, God himself referred to Nadav and Avihu as his krovim, as people who were particularly close to him, who were his relatives, quote unquote. Now, according to one version of this midrash, what Moshe was trying to do here was he was saying that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him that when God originally told him this principle, that he is sanctified through the deaths of people who are close to him, that Moshe, when he heard this on Mount Sinai, he had assumed that the people God was referring to, the people closest to God, were Moshe and Aaron, himself and his brother. And now the reason he says this immediately after his nephews die was to try to comfort Aaron by saying, well, apparently Nadav and Avihu were closer to God than Moses and Aaron themselves. Okay. And if that's the case, it's still a little bit hard to figure out exactly why Aaron responds the way he does with silence. Did Aaron find that comforting, and that's why he was quiet? Was he angry about this whole thing, this idea, or what happened to his children? Was it stoic silence? Was he just shell shocked and unable to respond? We don't know. But Rashbam, who's Rashi's grandson, offers a different perspective on Moshe's words, a different understanding of what Moshe's message was to Aaron. And this second reading feels very connected and parallel to what I was seeing in the cemetery today. Rashbam says that Moshe was not saying that God is sanctified through the deaths of those close to him, through Nadav and Avihu dying. Bikrovai Kadesh did not mean God is sanctified through his relatives, meaning the ones close to him who die. The sanctification of God comes from those close to him, namely Aaron and Aaron's sons, the brothers of those who died. It comes from their behavior, the way the mourners respond to the situation. And it doesn't mean that he is sanctified through their mourning, but rather the opposite. That the relatives of God are Aaron and his surviving sons, and they're going to be asked to do something nearly inhuman despite the tragic loss that they just experienced. It's not through the mourning, it's through the opposite. Then Moshe goes on to explain that Aaron and his sons will not be allowed to mourn, lest they too be punished and cause the death to spread to the rest of the Jewish people. Vayomer Moshe al Aaron ul'Elazar Itamar banav. Moshe says to Aaron and to Elazar and Itamar, Aaron's son, to the brothers of Nadav and Avihu, Rashechem al tifra'u v'gdechem lo tifromu. He says, do not uncover or shave your heads. Do not rend your clothing. Don't tear your clothing. Don't tear kriya. Lo v'lo tamusu v'alkol ha'ida yiktzof. And this way you won't die and you won't cause the anger to spread to the rest of the congregation. Achichem kol beit Yisrael yivku et hasrifa asher saraf Hashem. And instead, let the rest of the house of Israel cry over the fire that God has caused. God has burned. Says Rashbam, the reason Aaron is silent then, if this is what Moshe's message was, that Aaron would sanctify God through his response or non-response to what just happened, his non-mourning, then we understand why Aaron is silent, because Aaron's silence was a fulfillment of his obligation to sanctify God's name by refraining from mourning and thus protecting the rest of the community from danger by continuing in his service in the temple, in the Mishkan during the inauguration. That Aaron needed to be silent to avoid crying in public, to not tear his clothing, to avoid observing Avilut and Shiva, so as to restrict the fire to just his sons alone who died and not let it spread. And Rashbam points out that the prophet Yechezkel, a descendant of Aaron, was also asked to do almost the same thing hundreds of years later when his wife died from also a magifa, from a disease. Ben Adam, says God, Ben Adam, you mortal Yechezkel, hineni lokeach mimcha et machmad einecha. I'm going to take away the person your eyes most love, the magifa, in a plague, in a disease. V'lo tispod, v'lo tivka, v'lo tavot imatecha. And you're not going to be allowed to eulogize, and you're not going to be allowed to cry, and you're not allowed to have tears come. He'anik dom mitim. You have to be silent, suffer in silence the death of people. Eva lo tasa peirecha chavo shalecha. You're not allowed to be a mourner. You have to wear your normal hat. Unalecha tasim v'raglecha. You wear your regular shoes. V'lo tatal safam. And you're not allowed to cover your lip. V'lechem anashim lo tochel. And you cannot eat the bread of mourners. You can't have that meal. Sivan Rav Meir writes that Rashbam is teaching us that there are times when we are asked to put aside our human need for mourning and crying for the sake of the community, to make sure that this one moment of death does not prevent the continuation of life. And I would add that it doesn't cause further death. That sometimes, in order to protect others, we have to sacrifice our own mourning. And what I saw and heard this afternoon very much felt like seeing Aaron and Yechezkel in modern times. But instead of the mourners being Aaron and Yechezkel, they were people like you and me, people of our generation, people who were very normal and who never had to make this kind of sacrifice before. And instead of being asked directly by God to refrain from participating in the funeral, they were being asked by mere mortals of the Jewish Cemetery Association of Massachusetts, who were doing it for the exactly right reasons. But it's harder to hear it from other people than it is to hear it from God. And watching this was absolutely heart-wrenching. Other than myself and the funeral director, no one was allowed to leave the car and follow the casket. The relatives couldn't see the burial, they couldn't participate in it, and they're never going to really get this moment back, even if they do something later. And no one was able to say Kaddish or even hear the Kel Maleh made in person. We did it over Zoom. And I felt so helpless, trying to give the family a chance to express themselves and to participate in the funeral. But I couldn't help the mourners to hear Kriya, and I couldn't give them any personalized warmth and comfort right in front of them. They had to do that alone in their cars. I said a few words of tribute about the deceased over Zoom, and I did my best to give the family a chance to share their own thoughts. But it's not the same thing when you can't do it in person, when you can't hold each other, can't be together. I tried to show them what was going on at the graveside with my phone camera, but I don't know what they could see or what they wanted to see. I could only show them what I was seeing. They effectively had to experience the funeral through my perspective as an outsider rather than from their perspectives as the relatives themselves. And they won't even get a chance to sit Shiva together as a family, and they won't be visited by myself and others and their family and friends either. They won't have that togetherness to help them get through it. The pain that this caused was obvious. You could hear the frustration in them being unable to gather together, and I could hear the relatives, the children, the grandchildren, the relatives cry in their cars into their phones over Zoom, and it broke my heart. It just broke me. I had a really hard time going through that. It was difficult for everyone, for myself, and obviously much more so for the mourners themselves. Now, why did we have to do this? Why did all these people have to stay in their cars and not participate in the funeral of the matriarch of their family? It's the reason they had to do this is because of a plague, a magifa, because of a virus. And they did it in order to save the lives of others. They sacrificed their own grief, their own catharsis, their own displays of love toward their mother and toward each other for the sake of the greater community, to prevent the spread of disease, to stop the death where it was. Today, they were God's Krovim, the Krovaya Kadesh, and they sanctified God's name. So many people are having this experience in recent weeks, and it's likely to continue this way for weeks and months to come. The former Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Bakshi Doron, passed away this past week, and there wasn't even a minyan present when, had there been no pandemic at all, there would have been thousands there. So many people are going through this Aaron and Ezekiel-like mourning experience, including others from our own shul. And it is inspiring to see that so many have risen to the occasion and put aside their basic need for mourning for the sake of the greater community. But let us also daven to Hashem and ask Him to end pain. Because the suffering are not just those who die and those who get sick. It's also the people, the other families of those people, and the people taking care of both the mourners and the families, and also the deceased. And we ask Hashem to ensure that very soon there will be no need for people to fulfill Bikrovaya Kadesh, and instead, may Hashem enable us to celebrate together in person and only happy occasions in the future. I want to wish you a a safe and happy and joyful Shabbos, and may we know no more sorrow like I saw today. Good Shabbos.